So welcome to our session called Conserving Tree Genetic Diversity for Forests and Humans. Forest and Humans. This session is organized by IUCN France and the French Commission for Forest Genetic Resources, CRGF. My name is Bruno Fady. I'm from the French Research Institute for Food, Agriculture and the Environment. It's called INRAE, and I will chair the session. I think it's not unnecessary to recall again that we live in a great environmental challenge era. It's never been experienced before by mankind. And these challenges are brought about by our human activities, mostly our consumer society way of life. This is called the Anthropocene. I have sort of a problem with Anthropocene because somehow it looks like the word was created to give us this godlike power of Prometheus. We can now modify the climate, we can now modify the geology. I see this era more as a vulnerability era, a high vulnerability era. If we use the Greek words for that, we could call our era the aprovleptocene, the era of unpredictability. Of course, international institutions have used several frameworks to reduce the negative effect of unpredictability. There's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There's the CBD post-2020 framework for biodiversity. There's the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, and there is the ongoing inter-ministerial process called Forest Europe. The goal is to keep global temperatures rising well below 2 degrees. In this context, and only in this uncertainty context of below 2 degrees, evolutionary mechanisms have gained great momentum. The evolutionary mechanisms create biological diversity that we'll be talking about throughout this afternoon, from individuals to populations to species to communities and to ecosystems. This is what we're going to talk about now, genetic diversity, the often differences that exist between genes, between individuals and populations. Foresters recognize that genetic diversity is needed for adaptation and that it should be protected for its own sake, but also as a sustainable forestry option. We're going to talk about this with 4 different talks this afternoon. The first one is going to be given by François lefèvre from INRAE, setting the scene. Then we'll have a joint talk by Aurore, Desgroux and Guillaume Roux about conservation actions in a specific reserve. Then we'll have another joint talk by Alexis, Ducousso and Gérard Peyrotty, also showing joint actions to protect biodiversity and sustainable management. And finally, we'll have a video talk by Michele Bozzano, who is the director of the European program on forest genetic resources. Finally, after the talks, we'll be happy to take questions. So, welcome to the session, and the first speaker is François lefèvre.
Okay, hello everyone. So, I'm representing here the French Commission on Forest Genetic Resources Conservation, but before I want to introduce you to the importance of genetic diversity for conservation, and in particular tree genetic diversity. So what are we talking about, and why is it important? So first, the forest ecosystems, they represent about 15% of the total surface of the earth, 15%, but they store almost 80% of the total biomass on Earth, and they also store 40% of the terrestrial carbon stock. So that means the forest ecosystem is very crucial for our world. And then it's not only the forest ecosystem, it's healthy ecosystem. And we can easily understand that the health of the forest ecosystem, its functioning, but also its resilience, depends on diversity in terms of mosaics. Okay? And the trees here are keystone species of the ecosystem. And you have on the left side, which is from French Guiana, the classical vision that we have of genetic diversity, which is the spacious level of diversity. You have many different species of trees in a single place, and in that situation, you understand all the opportunities that are given to other organisms and to the functioning of the forest. But also we must open our eyes, because within each species there is a huge genetic diversity that we are not always accounting for. Imagine, for example, a single species like Scots pine in Europe. It grows from Siberia to Andalusia. So you can understand there is a huge amount of diversity from boreal to Mediterranean for the same species. And it's not only between populations, but here what you have on the right is not far from here on Mont Ventoux. These are not dead trees. What you see here are fully healthy trees, but the picture is taken in spring. And you have in the same forest early flushing and late flushing trees, which are both two natural solutions to the same problem, which is resistant to drought. That means natural solution is not unique, there are multiple solutions. And this is part of genetic diversity. So the genetic diversity is inter- and intra-specific, and even within the forest. There has been papers that have shown that the amount of genetic diversity of trees is driving the diversity of insect communities, for example, and it's also driving the forest ecosystem function. There are famous papers by Whitham in Poplar in the US about that. Then this is genetics. It's just imagine the trees as humans. Okay, when you see humans, you see that all of us who are different one from the other. The parents are different from the children. The brothers and sisters are different, and each individual is something new on Earth that never happened before and never will occur afterwards. It's the same for trees, even if we are not able to recognize this difference. So when there is genetic diversity and every single individual is different from the other, that means there is a capacity to evolve. That means the generation will never be the same as they have been before. And this is really an opportunity both for humans and both for the ecosystem. So you have here on a single species, cypress, you have a morphological or adaptation aspect. Then you have to imagine that what is important here is the natural processes of the dynamics. The natural processes, some of them, they create new genetic diversity. The natural processes is not only erosion, it's also creation. Each single reproduction event creates a new genotype that never existed before and will never exist again after. Okay? So there are processes that create, and there are processes that erode the genetic diversity, such as natural or anthropogenic selection and other processes. So it's a balance, it's a dynamics. So genetic diversity means dynamics. Okay? So you need to have a dynamic view. And then this has to change our vision of conservation. Conservation must be dynamic, and this is what I want to show here. First, following Bruno's talk, we are in the Anthropocene. That means also that we have some responsibility on what is happening everywhere. Even if the totally protected areas, they are impacted by the climate change, where the humans have some responsibility. So we have some responsibility of everything that happens everywhere in the world today, in particular because of climate change. So then we should have some actions to restore, to support the dynamics of the ecosystem and the genetic diversity. And conservation is one of the actions that we can have, and protection of old-growth forests is another one. There is a mixture. Here, what you see on this picture is a kind of emblematic European tree. You have only 3 of them, which is a Sicilian fir for the whole species. There are only 30 individuals left for the total species in one population. And what you see here is that the idea is to conserve dynamic conservation. That is, conservation inside where the populations are left in natural evolution in the wild environment. It's changing and also evolving for adaptation to the climate that is changing and everything. So we focus on the dynamic conservation. It's not freezing nature, it's supporting the survival of the target species and supporting the dynamic processes that occur naturally. So what I will, to conclude, this session has been organized jointly by IUCN and the French Commission on Forest Genetic Resources, which has 30 years of experience of defining the national strategy for conservation of genetic resources. But of course, genetic diversity is not limited to one single country, and there is, by chance, a European coordination at the continental level. This is the forest within the Forest Europe proposal. More than 30 countries are involved in coordination of their forest genetic resource initiatives. This is also the U4Gen program, which has 30 years of experience too. So the examples that you will see here are testimonies related to a motion that was presented and adopted in the previous conference 4 years ago, to make a link between protected areas and the genetic conservation efforts. And the presentation you will see are jointly made by geneticists, let's say, that have the genetic point of view, and managers of protected areas to show the coping. So I will stop here and give the floor to the first example.
Thank you, François. My presentation that I share with Guillaume, I will present you different lens, the gaze of the scientist, as François said, and the gaze of the conservationist. Which advantages we can have in combining the conservation of forest genetic resources and the conservation of biodiversity through case studies, which is the nature reserve of the Vachere. So here, the example focus on two species, white elm, which you have here, and black poplar. So as you can see in blue, blue are the range distribution of each species throughout France. So you can see it's wide distributed in France. And we have the yellow spots that are the genetic conservation units. So you can see that we have several for each species, but why do we have conservation units if they are widespread? In fact, these two species live in really specific habitats, which are alluvial forests, and the genetic diversity of these species is threatened by a loss of their habitat. But why do the habitat disappear? So we have human activity that makes the alluvial forest disappear, like urbanism, agriculture, and construction of riverbanks. So what is the incidence of this on the genetic diversity? So you can see here in the initial forest that you have gene flows thanks to the pollination between trees. And if you cut trees, you make like spots and you enable the gene flows, because mature trees are too far away one from each other to cross. With this gene flow disappearance, so you reduce the genetic diversity of the species, because if a tree has a gene and can't give it to its descendants, then you may lose the gene. So genetic diversity of the species decrease with the time. And what we can underline of the combination between genetic diversity conservation and nature conservation is that a nature reserve unable to save the habitats of the species, and if we save the habitat, we have the good condition for a species to reproduce and keep the genetic diversity. and the conservationists are of great support because they follow the populations inside the nature reserve. So now I will just share the presentation of Guillaume because he couldn't get here today, so he made a testimony video.
Alors le lien entre la préservation des ressources génétiques forestières, ormes peupliers, et la gestion d'un espace naturel. Tout d'abord, ce sont des espèces qui sont intimement liées à la formation des forêts bordant les cours d'eau. Le peuplier noir, en association avec les saules, constitue la forêt à bois tendre. L'orme lisse, avec les chênes, le frêne, représente la forêt à bois dur. Et ces formations forestières sont l'habitat de très nombreuses espèces animales et végétales. Par exemple ici, dans la réserve naturelle nationale du Val d'Allier, plus de 1000 espèces de coléoptères liées aux forêts ont été identifiées. Enfin, ce sont 2 formations forestières parmi les plus menacées d'Europe dues à leur destruction à grande échelle. Deuxièmement, ces forêts assurent des services écosystémiques, c'est-à-dire qu'elles offrent de nombreux atouts à la société. Par exemple, elles permettent l'épuration des eaux en filtrant les excès d'éléments nutritifs provenant des abords. Elles permettent de stabiliser les berges et de limiter l'érosion grâce à leur système racinaire. Elles permettent de ralentir la vitesse de propagation des ondes en cas de crue et donc d'améliorer le dispositif d'alerte des populations locales. Et enfin, elles jouent un rôle crucial dans l'adaptation au changement climatique en assurant par exemple un tamponnement des températures et en séquestrant une très grande quantité de carbone. Pour finir, la préservation de ces espèces forestières est intimement liée à la fonctionnalité des hydrosystèmes. Par exemple, les graines de peuplier noir ne peuvent germer que dans des conditions écologiques extrêmement précises et dans tous les cas sur des surfaces minérales entièrement non végétalisées. Or, ces formes fluviales sont créées, maintenues, entretenues par les contraintes hydrauliques exercées par les cours d'eau. Ainsi, la préservation du peuplier noir et de l'orme lisse in situ et de leurs ressources génétiques est intimement liée à la préservation et ou à la restauration de la dynamique des cours d'eau. Car seule cette dynamique est à l'origine de la biodiversité si exceptionnelle, si rare et si menacée des milieux alluviaux.
I'm giving the floor to the next speaker. I'm calling Alexis Ducousso and Gérard Peyrotty for another example of in situ conservation. I am Alexis Ducousso. The aim of this talk is to present a case of genetic conservation in the forest of Vachere. This forest hosts a genetic conservation unit. A genetic conservation unit is a forest stand that contains population designated for conservation of genetic forest resources. In Europe, there are 3,660 GCU for 11 species. In France, we have 20 GCU for Cécile oak. It is a case of Vachere. And in our case, we will take the forest of Vachere as an example. The forest of Vachere is located in Haute-Provence, with the red arrow. It is southeast of France. Several characteristics led to the selection as a GCU. It is a marginal population for its geographical location on the climate. We are in Mediterranean climate, and Cécile oak is a rare species in this climate. This population has also several genetic features. In the provenance test, the birth is very, very early for this population. It's come also from the Italian refugee, and the combination of the red Cipidina setotype on this map and Cécile oak is very rare. Also, it is a mixed population. It is mixed with pubescent oak that allow hybridization. It is a key evolutionary process for the white oak. We selected also this forest
because it is a strong will of the owner, it is the city council of Vachere, and because it is managed by the ONF, the National Forest Services. This GCU is candidate for IUCN label Protected Area Type 4. We will submit this file as soon as possible. It will be among the first GCU in Europe and in France with this label. And we have another candidate close to Marseille in La Sainte-Baume.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Gérard Peyrotty. Je vais vous le faire en français, je suis plus à l'aise. Je suis technicien forestier à l'Office national des forêts et j'ai la responsabilité de la gestion de la forêt communale de Vachere. Je suis ici pour vous parler de mon rôle de gestionnaire dans une unité conservatoire des ressources génétiques. Sa prise en compte se fait à plusieurs niveaux et à différents pas de temps. Le premier acte, c'est la signature de la charte de gestion entre la commission des ressources génétiques forestières et le propriétaire. Vient ensuite la notification de l'unité conservatoire dans le document d'aménagement de la forêt. Il est primordial de maintenir les chênes sessiles et pubescents dans les mêmes proportions et de limiter également le développement du hêtre et du tremble. Nous sommes ici dans une situation extrême, climatique extrême pour le chêne sessile. Il faut donc être très vigilant sur l'état sanitaire des arbres. Pour cela, 16 placettes sont suivies régulièrement pour la hauteur, le diamètre, ainsi qu'une note du stade de dépérissement de chaque tige. La forêt de Vachere est soumise également à un fort risque d'incendie. Une plantation de sauvegarde de 1 hectare a donc été effectuée en 2010 dans la forêt communale de Villeneuve, à une trentaine de kilomètres, dans des conditions pédoclimatiques proches. Des glands récoltés à Vachere en 2014 ont permis d'effectuer une plantation en forêt de verdun. C'est le projet Géono qui vise à anticiper les changements climatiques en implantant dans le nord de la France des arbres en provenance du sud, porteurs de notre capital génétique. Du fait de la marginalité de cette population, nous manquons de connaissances pour assurer son renouvellement. Nous avons donc mis en place des expérimentations avec deux modalités, par petites trouées ou sous éclaircie forte. Arrivé au stade du renouvellement, le gestionnaire a l'obligation de régénérer la zone de conservation au moins 40 ans avant la zone tampon, pour éviter une pollution génétique des peuplements voisins. Cette régénération se fera obligatoirement par semis, et les semis seront protégés de la dent du gibier par une clôture. Si la densité est insuffisante, le complément se fera avec des plants issus de glands récoltés dans l'unité conservatoire. J'informe aussi l'animateur du réseau de toutes les actions prévues et effectuées dans l'unité conservatoire, comme les coupes, les travaux, les récoltes de glands ou la révision de l'aménagement forestier, ainsi que de tout événement imprévu pour porter atteinte à son intégrité, dépérissement, incendie, chablis par exemple. En conclusion, l'unité conservatoire impose sur le long terme de nombreuses contraintes pour le gestionnaire, qui nécessite un dialogue avec l'animateur du réseau et les scientifiques, et c'est une très grande richesse pour mon travail. C'est la combinaison des apports de la science aux pratiques de terrain qui nous permettra de fournir aux générations futures une ressource génétique qui, on l'espère, sera mieux adaptée au changement climatique. Merci de votre écoute.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry I cannot be there with you tonight. To start this presentation, allow me first to give you a brief overview on how Europe collaborates on forest and native resource conservation. Since 1994, the EU4GEN program, European Forest and Native Resource Program, was created as an implementation mechanism of the Forest Europe process, with the overall goal of coordinating the work of European countries on conservation and sustainable use of forest and native resources as an integral part of sustainable forest management. The program brings together experts from its member countries to exchange information and expertise, to analyze policy and practice, and to develop tools and methods for better management of forest and native resources. Over the past 25 years, EU4GEN has evolved into a reference platform for the science policy practice dialogue. But why is collaboration so important for the conservation of forest and native resources? So As you know, species don't recognize countries' borders. Species don't restrict themselves to just one country. Species are spread throughout all Europe. In the image that you see on the left side, you can see 50 species distribution range overlapping one on the other. And diversity within those species also varies within the distribution range. This means that in order to have a conservation activities that can really be very effective, we need to make sure that we conserve diversity throughout all the distribution range of the species. This is especially true since in order to properly conserve a population of forestry species, it needs to be conserved where it is growing, together with the other, with the symbionts, with the pollinators, with all the other organisms that grow in the very same site. This means that to conserve properly a species, it needs to be conserved where, populations need to be conserved exactly where it is. Countries need to, therefore, to implement also coherent conservation strategy. Now, in a time that climate is changing so rapidly, genetic diversity is extremely important because it's what it will allow our forests, our population, to adapt to a new condition. But in order to have this adaptive potential, we need to make sure that this diversity is there, is conserved. So in Europe, countries have identified the most valuable tree populations for the most important tree species through a network of genetic conservation units. And you just hear an example about this genetic conservation unit. So even if the situation and the interpretation varies across countries, we can find a clear common understanding between countries on what is needed in order to properly conserve the genetic diversity, in order to properly conserve these genetic conservation units that have been identified throughout the distribution range of various species. So those genetic conservation units need to be managed to maintain the evolutionary potential and process that allow a tree population to adapt to a changing climate. This is why we call them dynamic genetic conservation units. So this dynamism sometimes is just natural, sometimes needs to be created or speeded up. We need to ensure that the tree population can reproduce, can evolve, and they can adapt to a rapidly changing environment. Now, those genetic conservation units sometimes are in protected areas, sometimes are in old growth forests. And there are many different ways to protect diversity and nature. Sometimes just working away is the best thing we can do. But sometimes we need to actively manage the forest. There is no antagonism in this approach. Both need to be an option among the possibility that local authorities responsible for the protected areas need to have. In this way, this is why we say that to properly conserve genetic diversity, we need to have very well-trained managers, flexible policies, and continuous dialogue among the stakeholders. With this, I thank you very much, and the colleagues in the room will be ready to reply to your questions. Thank you very much, and I wish you the best for the rest of the meeting.
So before I give you the floor, I'd like to end with a few take-home messages from the presentations we had. First of all, genetic diversity, which we often in this half hour call genetic resources, is a central process for adaptation and evolution of biodiversity. Gene diversity is part of biodiversity. Together with species and habitats, genetic diversity is a key component of biodiversity. Actually, it is the central component which creates all diversity. It deserves to be conserved in appropriate protected areas. And so, as mentioned, the Type 4 protected area of IUCN works. Successful ecological restoration and afforestation depends on using the right genetic diversity, and I put the right like this because it's not so easy to decide what is right, but actually it needs to be talked about, it needs to be decided, because it is not just the right species that needs to be planted in a forestation program. And I see red, mechanisms. You need to think about diversity within species when you do restoration. And finally, silviculture and the conservation of genetic diversity are not incompatible objectives. in a sustainable management context. So with this, I'd like to open the floor to questions to our panel.
Si j'ai bien compris, c'est une unité de conservation qui mélange des chênes sessiles et des chênes pubescents, c'est ça? Et donc, dans le cadre du projet Juno, il y a eu des graines qui ont été prélevées et qui ont été plantées dans le nord de la France. Donc, on peut faire l'hypothèse que toutes les graines que vous avez prélevées sont en fait un essaim d'hybridation entre les deux espèces. Et ma question, c'est est-ce qu'il y aura un suivi sur le comportement de cette énorme diversité en fait que vous allez avoir pour regarder comment se comportent les générations hybridées dans le futur?
Oui, il y a un suivi. Ouais. Oui. No, we will have a survey of the population in the Verdun forest in this program, and we have tested with different molecular markers the taxonomy status of the different progenies. Because we have harvested different progenies of Cicilo currently, and we have tested the genetic status and the genetic diversity within each progenies, and we have information of the rate of hybridization within each progeny.
Sorry, I spoke in French.
I just want to insist on something because I don't know if you understood from the presentation, but we are focusing on in situ conservation, which is the conservation on site. But of course, in the perspective of climate change, the most interesting population for the future are maybe some populations at high risk. And then we have kind of safety practice, which is making a copy of the population away, etc. But this is not the main focus. The main focus is really to try to support the dynamics where it is more difficult, because we are convinced that in the marginal sites, probably there is interesting evolution towards adaptation to drought and so on. So this is more a safety attitude to make a copy, but this is not the main topic of the.
If I can add something on the white elm conservation units, for example, we identified a regeneration problem, and so we have a copy of few trees in a collection ex situ, but we also try to find why we don't observe generation in situ and try to support this natural regeneration. So, yes, the main goal is to find a way to have the population in situ and to find a way to adapt it to its changing environment.
Some time ago I was walking on the forest canopy in the tropics together with geneticists, and we have shown that there is a special genetic variability inside one tree. I mean, several branches have slightly different genomes. Did you observe this in Europe?
We have observed this for one tree, for pediculate oak, and we have found different mutations in the different branches. It is a work done by Christophe Plomion.
But you can extend the story. For example, the black poplar, which has vegetative propagation, branches are cut and they can move of tens of kilometers, the same individual that is propagated, and during all that time there are some mutations that can occur. So the concept of individual in those vegetatively propagated trees is, but we are focusing on population level.
Is there any other questions?
Yes, I have one of my own. In this last take-home message, we mentioned that silviculture and conservation of genetic diversity are not incompatible. I was wondering if you think that strict conservation, the way it was talked about in the previous session with old-growth forest, could those old-growth forests also be gene resources for the future? Would you say yes or no?
I will try a start, and I will let my colleague continue. My point of view is that depends. For species with you don't have natural regeneration, then you cannot ensure that you will conserve the genetic diversity of the species in this population. If you have enough major trees and natural regeneration to ensure this conservation, then yes, why not?
I would say that the first answer is that both are needed. The question is, could they be on the same site? This is the other question. So it's not one against the other, both are needed, but then the answer depends on the species. Maybe for a pioneer species, old-growth forest might not retain the highest level of genetic diversity unless old-growth forest is in a disturbed ecosystem. We are talking about, for example, a riparian forest. What is an old-growth forest in a riparian ecosystem that is yearly or every 10 years completely disrupted by the water? So it depends on the species.
I manage different species. For example, with a pedunculate coat, it will be very hard to maintain the genetic resources because it is a good pioneer. This species will be eliminated by the forest dynamic. With beech, it is completely different because it is the hand of the dynamic, and it is not necessary that the forest thin the forest in order to maintain this species, except in La Sangome with the climate change. Because now in this beech forest we see that the natural regeneration is more or less 100% of maple, different species of maple. And if we do nothing, we will lose the beech. And in the central part of this unit we will thin and try to save the very few seedling of beech.
Moi, je n'avais pas tout à fait compris ce que vous avez dit. J'ai visité le truc de la Sangome, j'ai vu des hêtres.
Oui, mais dans la régénération, la majorité, maintenant, ce que l'on a, ce sont des érables. Et il y a un peu de hêtres. Quand vous allez dans les régénérations de cette hauteur-là, il n'y a quasiment pas de hêtres. Il y a de temps en temps un hêtre par-ci par-là. Et donc, si on n'intervient pas un tout petit peu, on risque de perdre rapidement. Mais là, il faut faire des inventaires, voir la dynamique avant de prendre des décisions.
Et j'aurais une question. Moi, je suis propriétaire d'une forêt il y a beaucoup de hêtres dans le nord de la France, dans l'est de la France. Et il y a pas mal il y a à la fois une forte dynamique de renouvellement du hêtre, mais beaucoup de dépérissement. Ce que vous dites, c'est que ça ne sera pas toujours comme ça.
Il y a un risque de perdre le hêtre avec les changements climatiques parce que c'est une espèce très sensible, mais on n'a aucune idée du niveau du risque au niveau de chaque cas. Et dans un cas aussi patrimonial que la Sangome, on a une ressource génétique très originale parce que c'est un relique. Non, c'est pas une relique, c'est parti d'un refuge glaciaire local qui a donné très peu de population. Donc on n'a que quelques populations méditerranéennes de ce groupe génétique. Donc il faut essayer de conserver cette ressource très originale localement. Donc là, on va peut-être être obligé d'intervenir, mais là il va falloir faire un suivi très précis avant de prendre une décision qui pourrait faire des bêtises.
I'm coming from the Plitvice Lakes National Park, and we have the virgin beech forest there. And just a question, if somebody plant a new forest near that forest, will it be bad for the genetic of that, of the new grown trees after? Or nobody knows, or
you will change completely the evolutionary trajectory, because you have new gene which will arrive in your forest by pollen, by a seed, and you can shift the evolutionary trajectory of your forest.
Yeah, you're touching a really actual question that is a current debate, a strong debate about the interaction between plantation and, let's say, local genetic resources. Yeah, it's not so simple. I think the main point is I don't know the English way to say that. In French we say rapport de force, the strength, the relative strength of the both. I mean, if you have a small plantation and a huge local forest, or the reverse, a huge plantation and a small forest, the problem is totally completely different. It also depends on the capacity to exchange pollen and seeds. Actually, probably most of the gene flow will occur in the plantation forest, not in the local population. And maybe this probably is where the hybrids, so-called hybrids, may occur. The question then is, can they come back? So there are many steps. So if you try to decipher what are the drivers, there are many processes, there are compatibility in terms of phenology of flowering, what is the distance, what is the relative strength of them, what is the fitness of the hybrid types. Maybe they will be eliminated very early, or they will be more fit than the new ones. So if you put all these questions, it becomes a complex situation. But the first point is the relative importance of your plantation, and so the relative importance is in terms of the number of reproducing trees.
Gen flow and migration are the main evolutionary driver, and it could be positive or negative. Don't see only on the negative effects, there are also positive.
Bonjour, désolé, je vais formuler ma question en français, mon anglais c'est un petit peu pitoyable aussi. Bonjour tout le monde, j'ai profité de la présence de l'ONF pour poser une question un petit peu piquante, peut-être, on va voir. La réponse sera peut-être plus, on verra. Dans quelle mesure la faune est-elle en danger pour la forêt, pour sa régénération, pour son développement, pour que l'ONF continue à coopérer avec les chasseurs? En espérant que ma question ne soit pas trop hors sujet.
Non, elle n'est pas hors sujet dans la mesure où nous, on constate des gros problèmes par rapport à la régénération, entre autres des chênes sessiles, mais pas que. L'impact de la faune sauvage sur la forêt, par endroits, on peut le qualifier de dramatique en fait, puisque sous les forêts, en fait, on n'a plus aucune régénération, c'est-à-dire qu'on n'a plus la capacité à refaire de la forêt. À maintenir l'état forestier, c'est notre mission en fait. Et si on n'y arrive plus, on faillit à la mission et c'est pas bien. Donc il faut qu'on arrive à gérer cette faune sauvage. Je parle là des grands ongulés, le cerf et le chevreuil, notamment, il n'y a pas que ça. Mais dans nos régions, c'est plutôt ça. Donc il faut qu'il y ait un acte de chasse pour réguler ces populations, sinon, je ne parle pas là uniquement que pour la forêt, je parle là aussi pour l'agriculture, puisque les dégâts à l'agriculture sont énormes aussi. Sinon, gérer la forêt va devenir par endroits impossible, ou alors à un prix exorbitant et pour des résultats tout à fait aléatoires, parce que les animaux, quand ils ont faim et qu'ils ont de quoi se nourrir derrière une clôture, très souvent ils savent passer la clôture et aller se nourrir à l'intérieur des clôtures. Et puis clôturer les forêts, c'est pas un but non plus du gestionnaire, ni une vision de la forêt que peut avoir la population. Donc l'acte de chasse, à mon avis, on peut en discuter beaucoup, mais à mon avis, moi, ce que je constate en tout cas de gestionnaire au quotidien des forêts, oui, l'acte de chasse, il est pour le moment encore indispensable. Et je voulais dire autre chose, je ne sais plus ce que c'est.
Je vais juste ajouter une petite chose, je pense que c'est comme pour l'hybridation entre de ce dont on parlait tout à l'heure, c'est un peu plus complexe que ça. En fait, je pense que ça dépend beaucoup de la pression de gibier qu'il y a sur la population. S'il n'y a pas beaucoup de gibier et qu'il y a beaucoup de régénération, ce ne sera pas un problème. Par contre, s'il y a beaucoup de gibier et pas beaucoup de régénération et que ce qu'on cherche à conserver, c'est l'espèce qui est appétente pour le gibier, alors ce sera un problème. Et je pense que ce qu'il faut, c'est de fonctionner en bonne intelligence et d'avoir des discussions entre chasseurs, conservateurs et gestionnaires et d'arriver à trouver un équilibre en fait, l'équilibre synergétique pour que chaque espèce, grand gibier et arbres forestiers puissent cohabiter correctement.
Is the gen diversity enough to regenerate new forests that are fit with the climate change? Like, I mean, you said that every human is a bit different, but if it is too hot or if we haven't enough water, we are going to die. And if for the tree and forest is the same, so I mean, it's good to select the tree that can fight the best climate change. But is the giant diversity is capable of this? You know, by an increasing temperature of more than 2 degrees.
So thank you for this very, very excellent question. I'm a geneticist. I've been working for more than 30 years on the topic, and my answer is I don't know. And then it is not because I don't know that I must not do my best to know the opportunity. I would say scientists don't know what will happen in 50 years from now if we are plus 2 or 3 degrees. We just don't know. So the question is, what can we do acknowledging our ignorance? Okay, so we have the humility of recognizing that we ignore exactly. And so we do our best. We don't know if it will work. And then what can we do? Is to maximize the diversity. And I will come back to here. The key word is diversity. So do not only stick to the species level of diversity. Sometimes, you know, even in forestry in particular, we think in terms of shifting from one species for another one. But if you do not consider the diversity within species, it makes no sense. So the diversity is species, populations, individuals, and so on. And then I will come back to the last but one, the third. The question should not be, well, it's correctly written, but it must be clarified. What is the right diversity? It is not the right genotype. The right genotype does not exist. We don't know. This is managing uncertainty. So what is important is to support as much as possible the genetic diversity. And again, recognizing that we don't know which one will be interesting, so we need to really enhance diversity. But your question is really an important one. Maybe it will not be enough. Maybe the trees will all... There are papers in the newspapers saying that I don't know which fraction of the trees will die or will disappear in the next 20 or 30 years. I'm not so confident in these papers because I'm not sure they account for the genetic diversity and evolvability, but still, it may be the case. But we have to do our best. It's a kind of responsibility. If we say, okay, it's too late, well, we don't know anything, that's not the option.
If we compare mine diversity and oak diversity, the genetic diversity of oak is 400 times higher than for mine. You can, all the trees have a very high genetic diversity. And you can see that we have a very important reservoir of opportunity for the future.
Sorry for the debate. But then the question is not, we are talking about trees, which is a particular life cycle, okay? One generation of trees is already behind the scenario of climate change, probably. So the problem is the velocity of change. It's not the amount of diversity that is available, it's the time left for genetic evolution, and this is more the issue.
Well, I think we will end with these wise words. I would like to thank the panel and the audience. I would like to end with saying that perhaps we should see genetic diversity as some sort of insurance policy. As humans, we see insurance policy. And an insurance policy is something we have to protect. It's also something we have to use. And as shown by the questions and answers by the panel, it is indeed something we can use up to a certain point. But we should use it and we should protect it. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Voilà, c'est bien.